to tonight's Friday night lecture, Jarls and Karls and Thralls, oh my, society during the Viking Age. We have Professor Terri Barnes, an Oregon native. She co-chairs the Social Sciences Department at the Portland Community College, where she has taught history since 2004. She specializes in medieval Europe, focusing particularly on the Viking Age in Scandinavia and Iceland. Her interest is driven by her own Scandinavian heritage and also inspired by the students she teaches. Her Intro to Viking History course at PCC is consistently a student favorite. She presents at conferences, she publishes scholarly and lay articles on the Viking Age in Ireland, but even more important, she has two passions, cooking and Viking history, and has a YouTube channel called Shield Maiden in the Kitchen. Please welcome Professor Terri Barnes.
Thanks. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Cool. All right. I like history memes too, so. And, so wherever we explore in the world, it seems Vikings have been there first. It's partially true. So thank you for having me back. I was here last October, and also shout out to the people who are watching on YouTube. And now I understand, I just found out today that this is the last lecture in this series, or for this year. So I thought, well, that's quite an honor to kind of bookend the thing, talking about Vikings, which I always like to do. So last time, I talked about some of the common misconceptions and preconceptions that people have about Vikings, mainly through the vehicle of my students, but people in general. And so today I'm going to do something just a little bit different and actually dive into a slice of Viking Age history that we know about with relative certainty based on the surviving evidence, and that is the structure of Viking Age society. But first, I do want to be clear about what I mean when I say Viking and what I mean when I say the Viking Age. Because in our modern times, a lot of people tend to kind of conflate Viking with Norse people or Scandinavian peoples who lived in this particular period of time in that place. But probably maybe some of you, maybe in this crowd, would know that while a Viking is someone who lived in Norse society, not everyone was a Viking, right? And to be a Viking is not an ethnicity. It's a social identity within a culture. And, you might also know that to be a Viking is just simply to be a pirate. And so it's a person who, or I should say, it's a job description. And there is a lot more to Viking Age society than just those people, although they were part of the society. And so I'm going to focus on a little bit of the larger picture. But I will probably add to the confusion and kind of use the word Viking and Norse peoples and stuff kind of interchangeably. But I hope you understand the difference there. And so like everybody else who was living in a pretty rough time in the Middle Ages in Europe, I mean, it's violent and it's a difficult time. And Scandinavian peoples at that time as well were, trying to just get by. It's a very difficult thing to do, and they were trying to be opportunistic in improving their conditions at basically every turn. And so their society is really structured to try to enable that as much as possible. At the heart of it, what we find is a culture that is very tribal, very clan-based, and it's based also on subsistence farming as the primary way of making their living. And so in order to first and foremost ensure that the community and the society can continue to survive, the entire thing gets structured so that that is possible always. And so today I'm going to talk about that and also this specific time period of the Viking Age. And so what I mean by that is that it's a period roughly the mid-8th century, so 750 or so AD or CE, and up to about 1100. But I'm also going to actually focus a little bit on the first part of that. And so I'm going to cover Viking Age society in the earlier time up to about the year 1000. And the reason that I choose that year is that it is at that time, give or take a few years before or after, that Scandinavia, including Iceland, become Christian. And Christianity changes things in Viking Age society for sure. And so that'll be a talk for another day. So we'll look at the first part of it. And so to start, I just wanted to kind of use a visual reference and see, is this what a Viking looks like, do you think? Do you know who we're looking at? The Viking characters? Yeah? So we have Ragnar Lothbrok on the left, and also Freydis Eriksdottir, who was the brother, or sorry, not the brother, the sister of Leif Erikson. But of course, these are characters from TV shows about Vikings. But do they look authentically Norse? Maybe a little bit. Yeah. I mean, the evidence that we have suggests that, yeah, they likely do, at least for some Norse people. But lest we should assume that all Norse people kind of fit this sort of, fair-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed kind of stereotype, we definitely know, based on science, that that's not true for everybody. That the picture is getting broadened quite widely regarding who these people were. And genetic science in particular is starting to tell us quite a bit in recent years. And especially as the Viking Age progressed and those people traveled farther away and settled in places that were far away from the Norse homelands, you have them mixing and interbreeding, intermarrying with other cultures, other ethnicities around the medieval world. And I mean, this is kind of important to note. For people who are in my business, we're always kind of running up against the kind of white supremacist view of Viking Age people, Norse people in general. And of course, history in the 20th century with people like Hitler and the rise of Nazism didn't do any favors to the Scandinavians in that regard because of their sort of mythical, Norse, Aryan, pure race kind of myth that they perpetuated. But, unfortunately, some of that continues even up into this day with some kind of far-right extremist type of groups who still buy into this idea that we're talking, primarily about these white people in European history who were the Scandinavians. And we just know for sure, and increasingly so with the evidence that we have in the science, that people who were Norse willfully mixed with a range of ethnicities and races. They just didn't seem to care about it in the same way that maybe, we're thinking about it in the modern times. And they would do that particularly if it benefited them to do so. Period. Again, I mentioned these are opportunistic people. So, but this genetic research that's so interesting, and one example is Iceland. And some of you, if you heard me talk before, or even in my introduction there, I spend time in Iceland quite a bit, and I know this place pretty well as far as its Viking Age history goes. It's really interesting because they've done so much genetic research there. Iceland was settled by Vikings in the late 9th century, and so it was an uninhabited place, and that meant that, and still means that Vikings are the indigenous people of Iceland. And they have done a bunch of genetic work on not only the modern Icelandic population, but of course also skeletal remains from the Viking Age. And it's very interesting that what we found is the people who originally inhabited it, the males were overwhelmingly Norse, coming primarily from Norway, but the females were overwhelmingly Celtic, not coming from Scandinavia, coming from places in the British Isles. And so we know now that Norsemen did this, going out into the world, going to places and taking females either as legitimate wives or, brides, but also as captives, as slaves and as concubines. And so, just little Iceland here in this way is giving us a good sense of the ethnic mixing that's going on or was going on between Norse peoples in their wider medieval world. But just a couple of fun facts here about them. Testing skeletal remains shows us that Viking people were strong physically. And that's, bone density type of stuff. And it also tells us that they were relatively tall compared to other Europeans. And they also, we have archaeological finds that tell us that they were clean people, which may not be something you would think of necessarily. But there are lots of sites where we find objects like this. Lots of combs get found. We also have here ear scoops, for cleaning out wax in the ears and dirt in the ears, and picks and tweezers, things like this. And so not only with this kind of archaeological evidence, or material culture as we call it, but we also have written evidence that describes Scandinavians, people who encountered Vikings. So these are what we call like outsider accounts, people who ran into them in various places that they went, and then wrote about it. And so I have a snippet of one of those sources from the early 10th century to show you, so you can get an idea about Viking hygiene. So I'll pause for a second so you can read that. Now I will ask you if anyone wants to volunteer to be the last one to get the water basin. So they're clean, but I suppose cleanliness is relative, right? Yeah. So here's another fun fact. What does this tell you about Viking Age people? They're younger. Yeah, exactly. They are. It skews a little bit young. And this is not unlike other people in medieval Europe, where the average lifespan was roughly 20 to 50 years. But they actually have the same life expectancy that basically all humans have ever had at any point, including now. It's just that when you look at the pure numbers, and you get an average, what's working not in their favor is the high rates of child and infant mortality. And so that pulls the numbers down and makes it look like nobody lives to be very old. But we do know the elderly existed in Viking Age society. We see them in the sagas, we see them in the law codes, and actually even specific mention of people who live to be into their 80s. So, maybe not something you would assume in a warrior culture like this. But we also know that they were somewhat seen as a burden because they had aged beyond their productive years. And the sources definitely paint a picture where people in this society would rather die young and bravely than live a long time and go through what they believed quite clearly to be the shame of becoming old and frail. So, but older people were there. Now, so the title of this talk, Jarls and Karls and Thralls. Does anybody know what those things are? Those three things are? So those represent the three kind of general levels of Viking Age society. And the way we know about them, or one of the main ways we know about them, is through a poem that survives and comes from roughly the 10th century. So it's an interesting poem because of the details that it has, but also as a primary source, it's giving us an idea of what they themselves thought about social class in this society. And so it is called Riksstilla, and it is a poem that we don't know the exact origin as far as which country in Scandinavia that it came from, but it's believed, scholars mostly believe it probably came from Iceland. And I think that's a good assumption because most of the written sources that we have, the literature, including the sagas and the law codes, do come from Iceland. But in this poem, it very clearly and simply describes the three main groups of people. So the upper class, the free class, and then the enslaved class. And it does this by telling a story about the Norse god Heimdall, who goes and visits three different households in succession. And in each of the households is a man and woman, so presumably husband and wife. But he spends time with them, and he spends some intimate time with the woman in the household. And then lo and behold, 9 months later, a child is born, and that child is the progenitor of each of those classes of people. But in it, you get some really interesting details about what they thought of each of those people in the society. And so You can see the slave class, the free class, and then the chieftain or the upper class. And, you know, the descriptions are things of like, what does their house look like? What kind of food do they have on offer? What are the types of activities that they're involved in? Even describing them physically, as far as you can see, they're swarthy, ugly, or having rosy cheeks and sparkling eyes and so forth. And then the names that they give their children. And, you know, again, it gives us a very clear idea of a very class-conscious society. And they understand the distinctions between each of these groups. And so what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about these three groups and tell you, you know, who's in them. I mean, you can kind of see it up there a little bit, but also what, you know, the conditions of their lives were like. And I'm going to start at the bottom. So the enslaved class, or as the Old Norse, Thrall, and the English version of it there, Thrall. So you might think of our word enthrall, because that's where we get this word, which means to, you know, sort of be held captive or be captivated by something. And a thrall was an enslaved person, somebody that they would recognize as a slave. And this is something that predates the Viking Age in Scandinavia, in Germanic tribes. They were unlike, they were like basically almost every other human culture that's ever existed in the ancient and up through the medieval world, and even in some parts of the world today, where we have this kind of underclass of labor. And like most enslaved people throughout history, aspects of their daily lives are not well known as far as being documented. We don't have people who are interested in writing the biographies of enslaved peoples, and so you don't find it a lot. Couple that with the fact that at this period of Viking Age history, Christianity's not there yet, and Christianity is the thing that largely brings literacy and literature in the way we think of it in the modern era. I mean, the Viking Age in this earlier period, they had runes, which is an alphabet, but they're not using runes to write literature or even document very much. And so this is an oral culture. And so it would be even more unusual to have, you know, kind of documentation of an enslaved person's life. But what we do know about them then comes from the stuff that's written after the Viking Age proper, and it primarily includes the Icelandic sagas and the law codes. And they were similar to slaves in the ancient world in that the sort of the number one way that you are going to end up becoming enslaved, besides being born to unfree people, is to be conquered by somebody else. You know, if somebody comes in and takes over your village or your area and, you know, it conquers your people, then you have a good shot of being sold into slavery. And so we know this is what they did. This was a big part of the Viking raids. The Vikings were known to be, you know, as I mentioned, opportunistic and looking for portable wealth, but the Vikings also considered human beings to be portable wealth. And for a lot of us who kind of, you know, watch these in the movies and think Vikings are really cool, I mean, sometimes we don't know that much about this part of their history, but it is a big part of their history. They were slavers, full stop. And they were not unusual in their time. They were capturing people and sending them off into the very wide networks of human trafficking that existed all over Europe and Asia Minor, where Vikings went. And so human beings were a lucrative commodity for them. And they did have some of them that they took back with to Scandinavia. And those people, of course, would then be, you know, spending a lot of time doing hard labor on farms, primarily. But the majority of the people that they took on these raids would be sold off into other places. But, so, these people, of course, as you might imagine, as being enslaved people, they don't have any legal rights. They are very much considered to be property and can be bought and sold like any other piece of property. Though they did hard work, many of them were actually like servants, kind of. So there was, you know, a couple different levels of enslaved peoples in this culture. And so they were not always the equivalent of what you think about like chattel slavery from the ancient Roman world or even in the 19th century American South. Some of them had a little bit better conditions than that, but they're still owned by people. Many of the enslaved people we're finding out more and more were women or female. And of course, like I was mentioning, taking captives and going and inhabiting Iceland. This is a common thing, and of course that also most certainly means that sexual slavery was practiced as well. They could be killed like other animals, just at the whim or will of their owners. And this is another kind of dark side of Viking Age history that seems interesting to some people, but they practiced human sacrifice. And we have not only archaeological evidence, but written evidence of this as well. So as a matter of fact, the source that I showed you of the eyewitness account about their cleanliness also wrote a very famous account about watching a slave girl be summarily executed in order to go with her master into the afterlife. And it's a vicious, horrifying account. It brings the realness of this period right down to earth. And so we don't know how often, or to say that it happened all the time, but we definitely know human sacrifice did happen, and in very ritualized ways. And it was likely enslaved people who were the ones. This is also something that you took with you for your whole life. If you were born of enslaved people, you're not born a free person. They did have a mechanism for you to be potentially considered free if your mother was enslaved, but your father was not. If he was free and he chose to acknowledge his paternity over you, then you could be considered born free. But otherwise, if your dad is an enslaved person, forget it. You are also enslaved. Slaves could be freed in this society and or saved to buy their freedom. I mean, that sounds kind of like a weird thing to say when you're talking about enslaved people, because that's usually free labor, right? But there were some minor kind of small cases every once in a while we know of where people, an owner would allow a slave to keep a little bit of the extra money if they made, some extra money at the market selling produce and stuff. But of course, as you might imagine, it didn't happen very often. And so the most likely way, if you were going to become free, would be your owner would free you. Once you were freed, though, you actually maintained a relationship still to the person who used to own you. They become sort of a patron of sorts. And even if you were, as a freed person, not capable fully of maintaining or supporting yourself, legally, your former owner was still on the hook for supporting you financially and treating you as a dependent. And so they become kind of a patron who, I don't want to say father figure, but in the Icelandic laws, it sort of reads that way, because again, you become a dependent of theirs. And if you are a freed person, you don't have any chance of actually achieving any kind of level of full rights as somebody who is born free. Being born free is always going to be a completely different classification. So freed is going to get you not being owned by somebody and a level above the people who are still enslaved, but you're never going to be acknowledged to be somebody who is like a free person, except for this one case where you are, as it says, led into the law by your chieftain. And that means being taken to the public assembly and having, the person who's basically in a leadership position in power in your community say to the world, I acknowledge this person as a fully freed legal person. And then your status gets raised a bit there. But of course, as you might imagine, this didn't always happen. I mean, I think the setup for actually freeing one of your slaves, the laws as they were structured really kind of discouraged that in my mind because of this dependence issue, right? And so it's like, why would you want to free somebody? And then if they can't fully take care of themselves, you're on the hook for it still, and you don't own them anymore and can't compel them to work for you. So it's like, why would you even do that? But that's the way their law was. So most people, if they got freed, would really end up becoming, again, kind of one rung above the other people who were still in servitude, and they wouldn't generally become landowners because they couldn't have enough wealth to achieve that, and so they're these landless laborers basically, or maybe household help if you were female. So not a good life, as with enslaved people everywhere. Now the Karls. So this is the everybody else basically, because this is the free crowd. The people who are born free. And so, as you might imagine, it is a group that is fairly varied. A lot of farmers, because again, we're talking about this is agrarian life, even though we know they hunted and fished and stuff, but this is largely agrarian life in Scandinavia and even in Iceland. And so farmers, craftspeople, merchants to the extent that there were, and then of course the warriors, the Vikings, they come from this group as well. This is, Viking activity is seasonal and as need be as far as warfare is concerned. And so what you're really talking about, maybe in like American history type equivalent, is a militia. These men are farmers, 90% of the time. And then when they go off and do the raiding and trading thing, or when they need to fight, then they pick up arms and they fight and they become warriors. These people, because they're born free, all are protected under the law. And so they do have legal rights, and part of those legal rights would be that they could speak and represent themselves at the public assemblies, which the Old Norse word for that is a thing. As you can see, well, it looks like ping, but the thorn in the Norse language. And so the thing happens at a kind of a regional, local level. And then in Iceland, they had a bigger one that was national that happened every June called the Althing. And it was an amazing event. But these assemblies are where you had all of the debate over legal and political issues. So justice happened there to the extent that it existed in Viking Age society. And they even had court systems and everything. I mean, one scholar has referred to the setup with a thing as a proto-democracy. I mean, it's a really interesting part of this culture. But so they could speak at the public assemblies. They also had the legal right to carry weapons, which not everybody did. And so that distinguishes them. And then another thing that distinguishes them is this thing called blood worth. And other cultures in the world have done this as well, so it's not unique to the Viking Age. But the Old Norse word for it, you can see there, is vergild. And vergild refers to the payment that is made by a guilty party in recompense for having caused an injury or death to someone in a family. So if you commit a crime and you hurt somebody who is of lower class, or you kill somebody who is of lower class, you're going to pay a lower fine than if you would have done that to somebody who is higher in social status. Right? So even within this group of people, we're talking about they're still making, it reinforces the class consciousness of this society because they are distinguishing based on blood and social value between them. And then the upper class, the Jarls in Old Norse, or the English word for that is earl. So, maybe it kind of sounds like an aristocratic title or something. I mean, these weren't aristocrats. They weren't nobility because Viking Age society wasn't structured like that. But they were the upper class. And these are the men in this tribal society who become the chieftains and, of course, the members of their families. And the chieftains are in leadership roles. And so what does it mean to be a chieftain in this kind of society? It's different than what's going on in the rest of Europe at the time. Viking Age society is, as you look at it, it tends to be much more horizontal and lateral than vertical. And I mean, I'm telling you all about class consciousness and everything, and so clearly they had, their classes that they understood. But when you come to this, because these are part of the free class, of course, when you come to this big group of free people, free men, who become chieftains, chieftains are farmers, in essence, like everybody else. except for eventually somebody's going to make a distinction because they own a little bit more land than somebody else. Like every place in Europe at the time, Scandinavia was the same. In the Middle Ages, these are overwhelmingly agrarian societies, and so it means that the number one way to generate wealth and show that you have wealth is by owning land and owning more of it than somebody else. And so, when you have this land in excess, or instead of somebody else owning it, then, you kind of pop up your head above the rest of the crowd and you come into this leadership position as a chieftain. You sort of become like a big man on campus, if you know what I mean by that. And so these families who own this land or larger tracts of land than others, they have the wealth and they have the higher social status because of it. And then, it results in these kind of men. They are the ones who get to speak at the assemblies as well, like the other free farmers, but they also take on an advocacy role. So they even will speak on behalf of other men. Because this is a legal and judicial system there, what I liken it to, quite frankly, is what a lawyer does in the modern world. You engage the services of a chieftain for which he is paid because he has a reputation for being a good advocate who understands the law, who can help you in settlement dispute and get advantageous settlements as a result of that. Keep in mind, in this period of the Viking Age, we don't have like a king or a lord like they do in other places in Europe. So there's not this kind of real top-down structure. A chieftain doesn't necessarily really have power over these other men. It's much more complex than that. There's no state-sanctioned kind of disinterested third-party judicial type of system where there's like a police force or anything that helps to enforce judgments or decisions or arrangements that are made. All of this is going on between these men in these negotiations with each other, with the chieftains there kind of as the lead dogs, sort of fighting out these things on behalf of other men and hoping to come to good resolutions. And then it's on those parties then to actually follow the agreements that they came to. Nobody else is forcing them to do that. So keeping the peace is a precarious and interesting thing in this society. And so you see them as people who understand their propensity for violence as a way to solve disputes, like blood feud and all of that, but an understanding that they don't really want to do that if they don't have to, that it's better to be able to negotiate and come to these good settlements. And that's what a good chieftain is for. He's for some other things as well, but that's one of the primary roles of being a chieftain. Again, Viking Age society is not feudal like medieval Europe is. So it doesn't have that same kind of hierarchy. And the thing that really gives these men, these chieftains, their power then is it's the relationships that they have with the other farmers there and the respect that they get from them. And that's, in return for legal and political and economic support. And this is one of the important parts of it too, providing benefits to your followers. So if these free farmers decide to ally themselves with you as a particular chieftain, this whole thing is based on kind of this dance of reciprocity where you owe them things as well in order to curry favor and to keep that favor. And so, one of the main things you can provide for them, opportunities to gain wealth. So that means providing ships and the resources to go on raids, and then allowing them to share in part of the spoils, right? So that wealth they can get, but then also feasting. Feasting is an important ritualized thing where a chieftain shows his generous hospitality, shares the bounty of his wealth and his household and his farm in order to maintain, the loyalty of these people. It's like the whole thing that just sort of greases the skids, quite frankly, again, in this sort of reciprocal way. They would meet in places like this, which, it's kind of hard to tell, but hopefully you can see the longhouse there. This one is a recreation in Iceland, but it's based on an actual excavated site. So we know how big this structure was and what it was built like on the inside. And in there, you have, your chieftain's hall. Maybe doesn't look as good and glamorous as some of the ones we see, in movies and TV, or as large, but this actually is a pretty good sized one for an Icelandic chieftain. And, you have your central fire in the middle, and then the benches on the sides where your men would hang out, and they would hopefully eat beef, because that's an expensive meat for you to provide for them. They will definitely drink all of your beer or ale, and that's something very good and expensive to provide for them. In order, again, to just sort of seal this relationship that you have ongoing with each other. I mean, this is kind of a band of brothers, kind of fraternal type of society. And it also is very much, quid pro quo, because the men who supported and were loyal to a chieftain also had the right at will at any time to remove their support from that chieftain and give it to another one. So it was kind of the way they voted with their feet. And it's like, if you're a chieftain who's not going to provide me with good feasts and a bunch of loot from raids so that I can actually increase my own wealth and status in society, I'm going to go find a chieftain who can. And that's, I think, part also of the reason why the scholar that I mentioned calls this a proto-democracy. It's kind of like the way we vote now, right? I mean, we can vote for somebody and then withdraw our support and vote for somebody else if we want to. So, and this is so much, again, kind of a patron-client type of society. And so it is the patron who was seen as the most loyal and trustworthy, but also the most generous and hospitable, who would gain the most respect and support and political backing from the rest of the farmers in the community. Later on in the Viking Age, we will see the rise of strong Christian monarchs in the tradition of the rest of Europe at the time. So we will sort of start to shift to that more top-down power in a feudal system. And at that time, most of those kings will come from this chieftain class of people. Okay, so where are the women? Where are the women in society? I mean, this is a male-dominated society, I will say. And this is kind of a culture that's kind of made by men, for men, about men. But there are women there. But one of the things that I'll say right off the bat that's kind of disappointing to some people is that women were not Vikings. So, as I mentioned, Vikings are pirates, Vikings go out on raids, Vikings are warriors, Vikings do the fighting, and this is something that women did not routinely engage in at all, at least from the surviving evidence we have so far. Now, were there one-offs who did so every once in a while? Of course, because humans be humans wherever we are, and so there's always going to be somebody who does it. But for the most part, what we have is a society that does not condone this activity on behalf of women in any way, shape, or form, really. So what that means is women are largely engaged in traditional female types of activities that we see throughout cultures all over the world, meaning they are in more of the domestic sphere. So these are managing households and farms and children and food production, cloth production being very important as well. And I should say that, so much of the time, especially with my students, the response to this is kind of like, oh, well, that's a bummer. Women have to just be like, a housewife and do that kind of stuff. But it's like, okay, let me tell you how important it is to have a woman who knows how to run a farm and knows how to produce food. You know how much time of their day is spent in procuring and providing sustenance for the rest of the community in almost every way. These contributions are economic, domestic contributions that the entire community just cannot survive without. So it's really important. So don't be disappointed. Also in this society, free women did have some legal rights. And oftentimes when we look at Scandinavia and we think, oh, well, this was a more egalitarian society and women were really powerful and had all these rights, this is what people think about. And when it's relative to other places in Europe, there is some truth to that. They did have some benefits or legal rights that other women didn't have in other places, particularly in this pre-Christian period, because again, Christianity is going to change some of that. But it does make Scandinavia seem a little bit progressive where women are concerned. women could inherit and own property. And they could also actually even inherit a chieftaincy. So, I mean, the chieftaincy was an office that was a marketable commodity. It could be bought, it could be sold, it can be passed on to heirs. So a girl could inherit a chieftaincy, but a girl cannot be a chieftain. A girl cannot do the roles and the responsibilities of it. So if she finds herself inheriting that, she needs to pass the duties on to a man in her community or in her district who can actually act out the chieftain responsibilities, even though she owns the office. When women got married, they retained their dowry and the bride price that was paid by the husband's family. And even though while they were married, her husband would be the administrator of the funds, it was still stuff that was administered, or money that was administered in her interest. And so if something happened to him, she got to keep that money. I mean, this is one of the things, too, about this society where it's the men who are creating the laws, and it's the men who get to act publicly as far as these types of legal guardian responsibilities. And so we find women at every turn need to have men acting as a legal guardian for them. So that's why he would be managing the funds while they were married, but it's still counted as her money. And if he dies, or he gets outlawed, or they divorce, then again, she got to have her money. She could also collect that vergild, the bloodworth payment, on behalf of her family if her family had had some type of injury or death in a blood feud, but only if there were no males in the family in order to collect. So even though it was a legal right that she possessed, it's kind of like a right of last resort, because they don't really want to give it to a female, but they will if there's nobody else. Widows and single women also who inherited and owned land could attend the legal proceedings at the public assembly. So that was an unusual thing, and only maybe about 10% of women were ever in a position to be able to do this. But there again, I mean, they could not act alone. They had to have a male representation if they, maybe found themselves party to a dispute or something like that. And also, women could initiate divorce in this culture, which is, somewhat unusual as well. Both men and women could initiate divorce. And there were several reasons that this could happen. One of them was just dissatisfaction. If they decided they just didn't want to be married to that guy anymore, they could initiate divorce. They could also do so if he disappeared for too long, kind of abandonment type of issues. If a guy goes off raiding and trading and doesn't come back, and as the law says, like they haven't shared a bed for 3 years, then that is grounds for her to be able to initiate divorce if she wants to. And also, if the husband let the family fall on hard times economically, then that was seen as a reason for being able to divorce. And then lastly, domestic violence. The laws are pretty clear that domestic violence of a certain level was grounds for immediate divorce, but the certain level is pretty high. The laws are very distinct about the types of wounds that a woman would have to receive in order to be like, okay, that's enough. And the wording is literally like, the blows have to penetrate the brain or the body cavity or expose bone marrow. And so what scholars sort of read into this is tacit acknowledgement that this is a society that actually socially accepts, sort of lesser forms of social or of domestic violence. Now, the sagas also talk about some strong women. And, these are some of the women that I'm mentioning earlier about, like, who own property and maybe have enough money to commission a ship to be built and to get enough men to crew that ship and to sail off and go settle in, some new place. There's a couple of very famous women in some sagas that do stuff like that. So you're talking about upper class women with some wealth who did have some power and respect. For sure, but they were still, restricted in all of these legal ways as other women. But the whole idea about the shield maiden or the woman warrior trope, it's just less of a thing. It doesn't really appear that much in the sources, but we seem to like it a lot in the modern world. And I mentioned when I was here last October, you know, how much my female students in particular are really invested in, like, come on, there must have been shield maidens, really? And, you know, one of the main reasons why, you know, we kind of get this idea comes from this source here, the Gesta Danorum, which maybe some of you, if you have your Danish heritage, you might know what this is. But so this is the Latin phrase for the deeds of the Danes or history of the Danes. And as you can see, it was written by Saxo Grammaticus, who was a Christian who was writing it about 100 years after the end of the Viking Age proper. And it's a history, yeah, that's very much meant to glorify the Danish kingdom and the Danish people. And so Saxo, as part of creating their own kind of mythical heritage, really glorifies the Viking Age and Viking peoples. And I mean, a lot of Saxo is very difficult because most historians believe there's large parts of it that he just kind of completely made up, that he's not really writing real, like, biographical history. But in this book, there is a section on Viking women, and, you know, he even calls out famous names like Lagertha, and this is a section where he really makes them look like Amazon women, you know, like these women are badass, big time, and they're very strong, and there's all this kind of flowery language like they prefer fighting and being at arms, you know, like arms and armor versus the arms embrace, you know, and stuff like that. So like they're traditionally very not female. And so they look like these amazing women, but mostly, you know, we think that going along with the sort of propagandizing nature of this book, that, you know, these women are made to look better than they really were, or if they even existed at all, just in keeping with the general theme of the book in the first place, and the purpose of it to make the Danes look cool. What I think of when I think of shield maidens in the stories in the Viking Age itself, what I kind of liken it to is Wonder Woman in our own time, you know? I mean, she's in the stories, she's interesting, she's clearly, you know, some kind of exaggeration or fantasy. Maybe for some people she's an aspiration, but generally she's not real. Or if she is, she's pretty unusual and super rare. In fact, both Norwegian and Icelandic law codes from the 900s to the 1200s forbid women from wearing men's clothes, cutting their hair short, behaving like men in any way, or carrying weapons. So how are you going to be a shield maiden if you can't even carry weapons? And so they just don't want women acting like this. And so here's one of the law codes you can see. You can become an outlaw, which means, you know, you get kicked out of the country for 3 years. And when you see there on the bottom when it says the case lies with anyone who wants it, that means anybody in the community can prosecute for these offenses. So again, we're talking about we don't have a third-party disinterested judicial system or a police force. We have everybody in the neighborhood watching everybody else and ratting people out who color outside the lines. And so, you know, they are definitely policing social behavior in this regard. And it's important to note that there are the same laws that also forbid men from behaving and dressing like women. Now, also an important thing to note, and for people like me, for historians, when we read law codes, and you might think it's like this really boring, dry stuff, but actually it's really interesting. You can learn so much about a culture by reading their legal codes and their laws. But you think, oh, okay, well, look, they've got laws that say people are not allowed to do these things. Well, as we all know even today, right? I mean, the reasons laws exist is because people do those things. And the society has decided as a collective, and in this case we mean the men, have decided we don't like women acting like this. And so because some of them are doing it, we're going to make a law and disallow that. And so it's something that happens, but it's also something that is seen as very socially unacceptable and is not condoned. And on this topic of sex and gender, I will also say that it's important to note that several sources are very clear about Scandinavian Viking Age society being homophobic. not only male or female and male sexuality, but primarily male sexuality. And the sagas, I mean, if you've ever read them, there are a lot of homophobic insults in the sagas and the poems. And so men who engage in homosexual acts are pretty much treated with contempt in this society, particularly the ones who were more submissive sexually. And at the heart of this lays the assumption that if a man subjects himself to another man in this way, that he might also do so in other ways, including maybe on the battlefield. And so this is seen as reflecting a pretty dishonorable state of weakness that this kind of society is just not going to tolerate at all as a warrior type of society. And so being homosexual for them goes way beyond just sexual orientation. It really widens out into broader codes of ethical and social behavior. I mean, likewise, even being just effeminate, they didn't like that either. They were, hurling a lot of insults to people like that as well. And so, I mean, the takeaway here is that Viking Age society is very largely a traditionally gendered society, and multiple sources support this. And so men and women needed to stay in their lane, period. And, and so it's kind of contrary sometimes to the ideas that we think about with Scandinavia as like this sort of egalitarian paradise for the Middle Ages. And, in a couple of ways maybe, but for the most part, no, it wasn't that way. Now, Viking Age culture also, as I mentioned, was tribal. And so because of this, the other key element to their society is the paramount importance of family and kin groups. In Old Norse society, kinship and power were related, in that social power resides in the family unit and not with individuals. Individualism, it's something that is a pretty modern concept, actually. I mean, in prizing individualism and everybody kind of getting to do what they want whenever they want, within reason, I mean, that's really kind of a post-Enlightenment way of looking at human societies. When you look at the Middle Ages, they are way more concerned with the community and the family group than they are with individual people. So it's your connections and your relations that gave you your identity and determined your worth in society, quite frankly. And so the importance of alliances and the loyalties to your kin, it's reflected in so many ways, but even, again, in the law codes, where you literally have a legal right to avenge a death or an injury of a family member. And they also are very specific about lining or listing out, how you have to take care of your dependents as well. And so the protection of the family is something that must be done at all costs. And also the elevation of the family and trying to raise the status of the family, but it's all about the group. And the Old Norse term for creating a family, the brudlaup, or literally the bride run, as you see these two people doing here, but ultimately it means actually the marriage or the wedding feast. But this is, an explanation of a system that is actually pretty complex. They had a lot of process and some procedures for what it took in order to get marriage. Marriage was very common and it was expected of everybody. And partially it was one of the reasons also why they're not condoning homosexuality, because homosexual unions for them don't have the ability to get married and have children. And that means eventually the death of the community. So they don't want people to do that. Everybody's expected to find a husband and or wife and get married and have kids because marriage and producing children ensures survival. Marriages create households, and households are economic units. And then that means, again, everyone has a shot at surviving. Women did have the right to be consulted before being married off, but it was not required. Parents could and did arrange marriages in her absence. She definitely did not have the final say. And so, and a lot of this stuff, I mean, you might recognize if you know anything about human cultures anywhere. I mean, this is very common in a lot of types of cultures throughout the world and throughout history, where we get, arranged marriages, because a marriage is not about a love match between two individual people. It is mostly an economic and political contract between two families. And by families, I mean by the legal guardian, aka usually the father of the bride, and the man that she's going to marry. And so it's a contract, a business contract really between two men, and the wife or the woman is the property that's being transferred as part of it. But so then to initiate a marriage, the groom or the intended groom would go to the woman's guardian, so to her father usually, and would make the proposal, and then they would come to an agreement. A contract was reached. The bride price was paid. So he's literally paying for her, paying her father for her, and then that transfers, her to her husband's family. And so one of the things that was very important and is clear in the law is that they want people to stay within the same social class, marrying each other. And as a matter of fact, the laws discourage and even disallow poor people from getting married. And so the bride price part of this arrangement is really, really extraordinarily important. For one thing, without making that payment, the marriage is invalid, and any children that those two people might produce would not be seen as lawful heirs able to inherit. And so, the Icelandic laws actually stipulate a certain amount of money that you had to be able to pony up in order to engage in marriage. So again, they're sort of legally discouraging or not allowing people who can't afford it to get married. And I mean, this is one of the interesting things that I find about reading the law codes. It's all over them in so many ways that this society does not want anybody who cannot pull their own weight. They do not want you to get married and start a family until you can afford to do so, because if you can't afford to do so and then you start having children, that means there's going to be a bunch of people in this community who are going to be a drain on this society. There's lots of laws about vagrancy as well. They just don't want people who are not capable of holding their own and taking after their own responsibilities. Another aspect of this, though, that's important to point out here is that Viking Age Norse societies were polygynous. And that means men could legally be sexually connected to more than one woman at a time through multiple wives and concubines, and then, of course, also, probably sex slaves as well. Whereas women were only legally allowed to be connected to one man at a time. So married to one person at a time. And there are many sources that attest to this. And this is actually a system that existed prior to the Viking Age proper in Germanic societies. And actually, cross-culturally, this has existed, through many cultures throughout human history. But the polygyny that they practice, though, plays an important role in one of the more interesting hypotheses about why the Viking Age raiding phenomenon began in the first place. Because, people lived in Scandinavia before the 8th century, but then all of a sudden we get to the 8th century and we get this thing that historians call the Viking Age, because something special happened then. Well, that special thing that happened is in the late 700s, for whatever reason, and there's, again, lots of hypotheses about this, they just sort of bust out in unprecedented numbers and begin going and expanding into places that they hadn't really maybe been a lot before, and they start doing a lot of raiding and violence and stuff, and it's like, well, what the heck happened there? Why are they doing that? And one of the, again, the hypotheses about this is that what polygyny has done by that point in time in their society is created a situation where the wealthy and the powerful men have been able to basically hoard the women. So when you have chieftains or other men who have, high social status, who are able to marry more wives, attract more wives to them, and also attract more concubines. I mean, you would literally have families with daughters going, please, I want you to marry my daughter because you're a wealthy and powerful man, so you have the ability to provide her with a good life with material support and comfort. I mean, as the saying kind of goes sometimes, it's like it's better to marry your daughter and have her be the fourth wife of a rich man than to be the first wife of a poor man. And so you get these, I mean, this is very much a marriage market, right? I mean, these daughters are being bought and sold, and they want the daughter to go to the highest bidder because not only can the chieftain or whoever that man is take better care of her, but also by aligning yourself with them through marriage, you elevate your family's status as well in this society. But then what does that do for the rest of the young men who don't have any wealth or status, who are also of marriageable age? Well, they're out in the cold. And so then, as the hypothesis goes, it's those men who get in boats and go out and steal women from other places and or get loot so that they can come back and have enough wealth to pay the bride price and get a legitimate, decent status marriage. So it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. But so then what about the products of these unions? So children. Children are a very interesting and perplexing part of studying the Viking Age because they do not appear in the record, either written or archaeologically, in anywhere near the numbers that we think that they should based on just what we know of demographics. And so it's a difficult thing to find them in the record. But we do know some of the legal things about them. One of them is that they are made legal or legitimized in a couple of ways. So the mother acknowledges her maternity by breastfeeding them, and then the father acknowledges his paternity by sprinkling water on them and then naming them. And as you know, in Scandinavia, even to this day, we have patronymic naming systems, right? I mean, this is going back to this time where it's what is an indicator of is that legally the children belong to the father. So we get names like Eric's daughter or Eric's son. And so that's the legitimizing of them. Also, as I mentioned earlier, child mortality rates were high. So roughly 50% of kids don't make it to age 5. And so we also, probably adding to this problem, is we know that infanticide was practiced as well. And so infanticide, which, so this is not just a gruesome Viking thing. I mean, lots of cultures throughout history have done this as well. But it's, killing of infants generally through exposure to the elements. And it's generally practiced, at least in this culture, when the children were deformed or disabled or otherwise sickly, didn't look like they were going to thrive, but also could be done when the family fell on hard times economically and the child just, simply became that one mouth too many to feed. And it does get banned eventually when Christianity comes in, but there actually is this fairly long sort of transitional period where even when Christianity is in Scandinavia, the Christian church allows them to still practice this because it was part of their traditional system prior. Some scholars have suggested that female infanticide was practiced more often, i.e. they have selective killing of infants because they want to kill female infants more than male infants. But this is something that's very, very hard to prove archaeologically speaking. I mean, we can definitely do looking at skeletal remains of infants, male and female, and determine how they died and stuff. But even if they were murdered, it's very hard to tell intent, right? You don't know if they actually literally were selecting and intended to kill more females than males. But one thing we do know, and Neil Price, who's an archaeologist, wrote about this in his book about Viking Age history a couple of years ago, and that is through looking at skeletal remains of infants, we see that the malnutrition rates for female children were higher than for male children, upwards of like 30% more. And so that means that they were deliberately feeding male children not only more food, but better food than females, and they were doing it routinely. So that would give you at least some indication that this is probably a culture that prefers males. Which, it's a male-dominated warrior culture, so that's, probably not something that should be a surprise. Also, children reached adulthood at age 16, or once, as it says in the law, once they have lived through 16 winters. So as some of you probably know, Scandinavia only has 2 seasons, summer and winter. And so once you have lived through a winter, that's another year in your life. And if you're a boy child, then you're 16 adulthood, and you can inherit, so legally. And then for females, also 16 if you are married by that point in time. But if you are still single, then it takes you until you're 20 to reach adulthood. And then lastly, it's very interesting that we don't know very much what Viking beliefs were about what happened to children after death. The Norse, or what we call Norse mythology, they wouldn't have called it that, but their polytheistic system prior to Christianity, of course, we know about the different realms and things that exist in that cosmology, and probably for us the most famous in the afterlife place is Valhalla. But that's for the slain warriors, and only like half of them to boot. And so where does everybody else go? Largely in Niflheim, or what is also known as hell, with one L, not two. Not a place of punishment like the Christian hell, but it's a sort of an underworld that is, overseen by the, she's considered a monster, not a goddess, but her name is Hel. And this is where, women go, where the elderly go, and all of that. So probably, maybe a good guess that that's where children would go as well, although it's not explicit in the sources. And so we just don't know. And also rune stones, which tended to be raised in memory of somebody. We've never found any rune stones that were ever raised in the memory of a child. So, children are just kind of a very interesting question mark. So, to sum it up, Viking Age society, what we have here very much is a male-dominated farming, trading, and warrior society. And it is also very family-oriented and traditionally gendered, and kin relationships are central not only to survival, but to your social identity and your social power that you could attain. The focus was not on the very old or the very young. They would be seen as dependents who have to be supported, and so they are more of an obligation. And importantly, they were a very honor-coded society who believed very much that good reputation and lasting fame that mattered a lot, were some of the most important things that mattered. And so, it is a society where, above all, for men, what was important in life was to have wealth and status and be looked upon and remembered for your great deeds. Having a lot of sons, being honorable and loyal and magnanimous, and all the hospitality and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that's for them what created lasting fame, your good name. Because, and again, this pre-Christian period of time, they don't believe in the eternal soul like Christians will bring to them. And so what was eternal for them was, their name and their reputation. And so I have just one sentence or two here of an example from one of the sagas about the death of a man named Ari. This news of Ari reached Iceland the following summer. His brother Thorvard began the composition of a short elegy about Ari because he believed that the most faithful memorial to Ari's death should be verses which, enshrining his courage, were broadcast as widely as possible. So the best thing to do is write about Ari, right? So we can spread the word, people will talk about him, people far and wide will know, and they will remember. And so there's no doubt in my mind that the people who lived in Viking Age society would absolutely love the fact that we are still sitting here together tonight, talking about them, remembering them 1,000 years later. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barnes. Now we have a little time for a few questions, but before we start, while you're formulating your question, I know you want to delve more deeply into this. And lucky for you, in September, Professor Barnes is teaching a 3-session class here on exploring the Viking world. So just put that in the back of your mind as you're formulating questions. So do we have some questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. That was a great talk. Showed some of the warts of the Vikings, which I didn't expect, so that was interesting. Yeah. I'm curious, you were talking about the medieval cultures, and the Vikings sound like they were just a job within that culture. Mm-hmm. But why did the Vikings stand out compared to, say, Germanic culture, French? I wonder if there's a similar type of class that we think about.
I mean, it's actually a good question because you hear so much about them being kind of unique and unusual and whatever, but when you look at them in the scope, I mean, I've thought this many times in my research, it's like, well, it kind of seems just similar to this other culture over here, so what's so special? But I think one of the things with the expansionist stuff, right, so they actually, and largely like through the capabilities of their ships. So they're really good at seafaring. They're really good at shipbuilding. It's better than anybody else at the time. It allowed them to go farther and get places that nobody else was doing, whether it was across large oceans or up riverine highways, you know, in what is now Russia or what have you. And they're just very successful at it. They're successful at the raiding, for, you know, however we might feel about that. They're very successful at that. But they actually literally went farther than any of their contemporaries at the time. They went to what is now more than 40 present-day countries, intermixed with more than 50 different cultures and ethnicities. And so, you know, it's just, and of course, as we know, right, they beat Christopher Columbus to the punch by 500 years by touching down in North America. The first person of European descent was an Icelander born in North America. Named Snorri Thorfinnsson around the year 1000, so that's in the Viking Age. So there's just kind of these firsts like that, but I think it's the ships and the expansionism that, you know, sets them apart a bit from other medieval Europeans at the time.
We have a question from our listeners online, seeing this live.
Yeah.
Dick Lewis asks, what can you tell us about song and story in Viking culture?
Oh, it means everything. Literally means everything. Like I mentioned earlier, you know, we are talking, at least in this earlier period that I mentioned before Christianity comes, it is a proto-literate culture, and so everything is about telling stories. You know, all information is passed orally, and everything, enculturation of young kids, that's how they learn. You know, they hear poems, young boys hear poems about, you know, what it means to be a brave warrior and how it is to comport yourself, never leave the battlefield, always be brave, you know, this kind of stuff. It's how they reinforced and created their entire culture was through stories and poems and songs. Yeah.
Great. And join me in thanking Professor Barnes for an outstanding talk.
Yeah,
Thank you
you're
so
welcome.
much.